Hello, everyone. We're going to start this process. So we can all just sort of settle down a little bit. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. Tonight I have the honor of introducing Pat Burt, our mayor. But first, before I do a little introduction, I wanted to recognize the people in the audience who are the dignitaries. We have several former mayors. We have former Mayor Larry Klein. And before we clap, why don't you hold all of the applause until the end of the introduction, so we can do one big applause for everyone. Who are you? Oh, who am I? I'm Greg Scharf, the vice mayor. That's right. No one introduced me. So I'm Greg Scharf, the vice mayor. So Larry Klein, our former mayor. Judy Kleinberg, our former mayor. Vic Ojakian, our former mayor. And then I wanted to introduce the mayor of East Palo Alto, Donna Rutherford, if you want to just stand. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Council member Rod Sinks. And I want to introduce Larry Moody from East Palo Alto. And then Barry Chang, from mayor of Cupertino. And if there's anyone else in the audience who's a public official that I missed, just raise your hand right now, because I just wanted to make sure I don't miss anyone. All right. And then we also have the district director for Rich Gordon, Andrew Berthelsen. Welcome. Over there in the corner. We have Ann Ream, Deputy District Chief of Staff for Anna Eshu. Welcome. And we also have the policy aide to Michaela Hellman-Tincher from Supervisor Simitian's office. Welcome. And we also have Lisa Chung from Senator Jerry Hill's office. And welcome to you as well. All right, now we can do the applause for all of our public officials. Now, briefly, I'd also really like to thank our vendors. I'd like to thank Phil's Coffee for providing the free coffee. And I'd like to thank Koopa Cafe and California Pizza Kitchen and The Counter. Looking forward to those burgers, too. Hope they brought some. And then Chantel Goulion. Hopefully I got that right. So thank you, if we can clap for them. Yeah. And if there are any board and commission members in the audience, if you could stand up. So now I have the honor of introducing our mayor, Pat Burt. Pat has served our community for over 20 years as first a neighborhood leader on the Planning Commission. I think the Planning Commission for 9 years. And now this is his 9th year on City Council. 9's a good number for Pat. I've been really impressed with Pat's focus on the issues, his understanding of them, his in-depth knowledge, and also his commitment to the community, his focus on sustainability. So Pat's office is actually fairly close to mine on California Avenue. And I have to tell you, I always see Pat on his bicycle. I never see him ride his car. So he's one of those people that talks the talk and then rides the ride. So, you know, that's very impressive. And just before I leave that, I had to say that our council meetings, you know, have typically gone past midnight, all the way sometimes to 1 in the morning. And Pat, it's raining outside. He's on his bike. And he leaves on his bike. Very impressive. The other thing I want to say is Pat is really impressive in terms of his commitment to a sustainable community. And to Pat, that's been fiscal sustainability, his reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, his work on that. You know, overall, you just have to say that he is someone who really focuses on the issues he cares about, and he gets it done, what he cares about. Pat Burt.
Thank you, Greg, and thank everyone for attending tonight. It's a Wednesday evening, and it's great to have everybody come out and enjoy this this great community center. And this is the building that we're enjoying tonight. We've had the great pleasure of proceeding over the last few years on addressing what had been a many-decade challenge to renovate our buildings and our streets and our overall infrastructure. You as citizens voted a bond measure to rebuild our libraries and community center here, and I have to say that most of us think it is just an incredible, wonderful set of buildings, and we really view it as a new community gathering place and not merely a place for books. So we also had the opportunity to rebuild our Rinconada, what had been our previous main library, and it's just gorgeous and warm and has its own teen center, and we've been able to really start seeing what we can have after we had around 50 years without major investment in any of our civic buildings. We had been living and taking advantage of the investment of 2 generations before us. So we have now, as a community and as a city council, have really committed over the last several years to invest in our future. This is California Avenue that is really, for many of us, it's our second downtown, but for many of us, it's the community downtown. It's not where we have a regional set of visitors so much as where we have local people, and it had been an historic district going all the way back to when it was the town of Mayfield, before Palo Alto existed. And it really hadn't changed a heck of a lot. And we have now made it a safer, more inviting, more attractive, and warmer place for our community. And that was one of our recent investments. We also, just for example, completed 2 things at the El Camino Park, and that is an emergency underground reservoir and a beautiful new park on top of it. So this has just been the last few months it got complete, and if anybody, maybe most of us haven't been there yet to really take it in, it's a beautiful renovation of a park. But aside from kind of the glamorous and beautiful new buildings, we have more basic infrastructure. So over the last 5 years, we've done a real transformation in our investment. We had what was a community that many in the world thought was a center of technology and innovation, and streets that sure didn't live up to that reputation. So back in fiscal year 2011, starting in second half of 2010, we doubled our budget to street repaving in the middle of the Great Recession. And we had been in the process of beginning to make financial reforms, and we just made a commitment to do that. 3 years later, we added another 50%. So we are repaving our streets at triple the rate we were in 2010. At that time, we were at approximately they have a pavement index that's accepted throughout the whole region and state, and we were at around a 70, which technically says it's the good, but most of us wouldn't have thought it was good. And it was kind of these kinds of streets. We're now this year as of last year, we had tied the best in the county at, I think, a 79, and this year, I hear we're going to be at a level of 82. So this is Alma today. Here is one of our local streets today, or 2011, and here it is today. And this is going on all around us. But I do know that for many of us, we identify the street that still is in bad shape, and that's the one we remember. It took several years before people are starting to say, I see a pattern here. There's still that bad street, and I want that one fixed, and we're going to get to it. By 2019, 2011, we will have hit our goal of 85 PCI, which is 6 points ahead of any other city in the county, and frankly, I think it's the level of streets that we are looking for. So that's been a major investment as well. But we really have had a whole nother set of investments in infrastructure that have been lingering for us, that councils have been struggling with for over a decade. As I mentioned, most of our buildings were built over 50 years ago. This one is over 60 years old, a fire station. Many of our modern trucks can't fully fit into some of our stations. They're really inadequate, unsafe. They're not up to current seismic standards. And our public safety buildings, whether it's the police building or the fire buildings, understandably are required to be at the highest level of seismic guarantees. And we have several that are not. So the council, actually 2 years ago, worked off of the work that had been done by the Blue Ribbon Infrastructure Task Force that had looked at this backlog of projects that we had had building for a long while, over $200 million worth of expenses. And we had 3 phases of it. The catch-up, the keep-up, and then the new buildings. Mark, what do we call the new buildings? Move forward. And so we began in that catch-up. We had already started some of it. Much of it was things like the streets and sidewalks catch-up, but it's also things that are not so visible. Old air conditioning systems at our Lucy Stearns Center and a whole series of things that were pretty dilapidated. Work at Coverly Community Center. So we've done major investments in that catch-up and keep-up, and that's now built into our budget. Now we have the next set of projects which were completed on the funding at the end of a year ago when we as voters accepted an increase in our hotel tax called the Transient Occupancy Tax, or TOT, but most of us think of it as a hotel tax, and a commitment by the council that the revenue from this series of new hotels that are being built in town would be devoted entirely to these backlog of infrastructure projects. It wouldn't go to the general fund. It wouldn't be used for everything else. We said we're going to carve it out. Al Gore would say, put it in a lockbox and put it aside for the infrastructure. So the biggest projects on that are 2 fire stations and a new public safety building. And we're now at the execution phase of that plan. All the dollars were allocated. Now, of course, we're seeing construction costs go up, but we're actually seeing our hotel revenue go up as well. So hopefully those 2 things will track and we'll get the whole block. But we have over $150 million in that lockbox for this next set of infrastructure projects. This was, like I say, something that councils had struggled with for over a decade. But we have other things that we're thinking about in our infrastructure. For over a decade, we have recognized that we wanted to build off of the dark fiber, or the fiber commercial loop that we have, that Councilmember Niss was at a lead at putting on back in 1994, thereabouts. Yeah. And it allowed us to be leaders in providing high-speed internet to businesses that wanted to hook up to it. But for over a decade, we've been trying to figure out how can we get that to every premise, small businesses, and virtually every residence in the community. And we've looked at several different plans. We thought we were going to have chances to do them, and they just didn't pencil out. In the meantime, we have been, in recent years, having an income from that commercial fiber loop of around $2 million a year. And we now have $20+ million in that fund, and that is what we call an enterprise fund. We can't use it for other purposes, and so the council a couple years ago redefined and slightly broadened what we could use it for so that we can use it to help leverage the dollars of private investors into a fiber to the premise program and to a broader community-wide Wi-Fi rollout that we're doing successively. You've probably seen we have it in all our public buildings now, we're having it in more parks, and we're looking at an even broader plan to do that. So that is a major project, and in the coming weeks, keep your eyes open. We've been working on this for the last year, and we'll have some additional matters coming before the council that is moving that forward. We're all very hopeful that we're on the cusp of actually signing a deal on that in the coming months. But really, all of these things that we do are dependent on our city's finances. Without the dollars, all those things I just talked about simply can't happen. Not to mention the wonderful services of this library and our community services that are out of here and other places. They all depend on our budget. And when we were in the Great Recession, before the Great Recession, we recognized that we were in a financial problem before the recession hit. We had deficits out for as far as the eye could see and no funding source to be able to fix our roadways better than they were, no funding source for any of those other projects. And the council, starting 7 years ago, when City Manager Jim Keene came on board, began a process to work through and make our budget sustainable, to reform a lot of unsustainable employee benefits and pension systems, and to put in a new pension system for new employees, and to have the employees share in the cost to a greater degree. And I want to say that that doesn't come easy for employees. So anybody who, we often hear in the community, why don't we just do this and take this away or whatever? But we're talking about having to work through negotiations to get all of our city employees to ultimately participate in making our budget long-term sustainable so that we can invest in our future and that our children will have the sort of community that we've been able to enjoy. But this last slide represents one of our last great components of having a real financial sustainability. We had accumulated, as all these cities throughout the state, a long-term unfunded pension liability. And the council has asked the city manager to come back, and the finance committee has already addressed this, to begin the process of paying down that liability. And the way that the numbers work, we don't have to pay it all off right away. If we take a chunk each year, it really reduces our long-term liability by a lot more than what we paid in a given year. So it has that compounding effect of paying it down. And so that's one of the things that the council has already committed that we're going to be addressing this year. And it's really the primary long-term, the final element of a sustainable long-term financial plan for our city. That doesn't mean everything's going to be easy going forward. We already have our employees who are existing in a housing market that is going up tremendously. And all employees in this area were back in a period where employees for public sector had taken cuts for a number of years, and we're now having to adjust that, and we're having problems retaining employees, even as good of a city as this is to work in. So we have costs that are going up there, and we're going to have challenges on our budgets going forward, and that doesn't even count when we have our next recession. So even though we've addressed all of these structural elements of our budget, doesn't mean it's a cakewalk. We have to stay on top of this. We will probably have times in the future where we'll be tightening our belts again. But as of right now, we are in the strongest shape we have been in a long while on our city's finances. We have to keep working at it to retain that. But we do have headwinds. As much as we've done a lot of good things, we have, as I think everybody here knows, challenges today and challenges in the future. So I've spent a few minutes to talk about some things we've accomplished recently. I'm going to talk about the things that we've been addressing and will be addressing over the last year and the next year or two. Many of these things, the council last year really began to take on a whole series of problems that had existed, many of them as a result of this real rapid rate of growth that we've had in recent years and the negative sides to that growth. So first is the need to protect our local retail. And last year the council took several measures to expand retail territories, to add for additional protections for existing retail, and we'll need to continue to monitor this because it's really difficult to try to figure out how government regulations balances and interacts correctly with private sector motivations and incentives. And how do we get the right balance? How do we get not only retail, but retail that serves people so that they're in walkable and rideable distances? And that's one of the really important things that we'll see when we look at our transportation, is to have services that make them within a walkable and rideable and convenient access to the community. And we've also gone through real challenges on a whole spurt of growth. And frankly, I think for many of us in the community, the buildings that have been getting built have not been the sort of buildings nor the impacts or low impacts that we need as a community. We need to have buildings that relate to the street and are warm and engaging, that have enough retail in them, that have the right balance of what is built in them. We have been working toward less office and moving toward how do we get more residential housing built with our great housing crisis that's going on here and in the region. And we also want buildings that have very low impacts on trips, and we're moving in that direction. We adopted a cap, an annual limit on the amount of office growth that we will allow to 50,000 square feet in our three main kind of commercial areas of the two downtowns and along the El Camino corridor. But it's not just a limit so that when we have a boom year, instead of 50,000 square feet, we have up to 200,000 square feet built in a given year. But it's actually going to be a contest among the projects that wish to be built, which meets basically a competition. And that competition is about who has the least impact on trip generation and parking spillover, which building is the most architecturally outstanding, not just adequate, but outstanding architecturally, which is the most sustainable building, and which might have other community benefits related to what they're doing. So this is going to be a really interesting thing to monitor on how successful this can be, to not merely have us have some control on the rate of growth, but more important in my mind, the quality of that growth. So as many of us think today, we remember when Bill Clinton said it's the economy, stupid. Well, today we may have a different statement here. And we have in many of our intersections through a lot of the day really unmanageable, overwhelming traffic. This is both a really big problem and one that the solution is not going to be simple. But hand in hand with every one of those cars that drives, they end up parking somewhere. And the parking problems that we've had are really problems that are driven by the number of cars coming in and the percentage of single occupancy vehicles. So several years ago, now two years ago, the council adopted a goal of reducing car trips downtown among single occupancy vehicles by 30%. And that may sound challenging, but we've seen that there are other areas, other communities that have had real transportation management agencies that we have now adopted, and what are called Transportation Demand Management Programs, TDMs. So you got two new acronyms, TMAs and TDMs. The T is about transportation, so that's probably the most important part. And so we are working on that, and on the 14th of March, we're going to have presentations from our new transportation management agency that is working at getting that fully launched for the downtown area, and Stanford Research Park's transportation management agency that has initiated an entire one for the research park. And they did that in part because we basically said, we need you to address the trip generation in the research park, or we are going to look at other measures, or consider other measures, including controlling the amount of office space, even what's permitted under their master permit. And they answered and said, well, actually, you don't even need to tell us to do that. We're moving in that direction already. And they explained that they're moving in that direction because the businesses in the research park see traffic congestion as the biggest threat to the well-being of their businesses that they have. So the very thing that we as residents see as a problem, we're now seeing the businesses see as a problem as well. And so I think out of that convergence of what we see as the issue and the challenge, we have an opportunity together to really address this and solve it. That's not our only problem. This economic growth has meant that we now have incredible escalation in housing costs and rental housing costs and apartment costs. And we're hardly alone. We're not alone in that traffic problem. If we look at the region, everywhere we go, we're experiencing similar things. And the same thing is happening on housing costs throughout. But housing in Palo Alto is amongst the most expensive in the country, or is it even the world? And our challenge is how can we have housing that will minimize or even not contribute to trip generation and not overwhelm our school systems. When we had kind of a last wave of housing growth from 2003 through 2008, it was principally in South Palo Alto. And it was at locations that we actually hadn't intended to have the housing. The decade before, we had most of our housing growth in North Palo Alto, and we said, yes, we want to put it here, and a lot of it was contentious, but it was deliberate. What happened in the South Palo Alto is that property value for housing became, after the dot-com bust, was one of the few property investments that was still worth doing, and we had a bunch of developers just flock to it. So one of the few places they could put their money, and so we had a lot of housing growth. When Council Member Larry Klein at the time initiated to look at having where commercial land had historically allowed housing by right, it's now a conditional use permit. So it's still allowed, but it has to come before us and say, is this a right location? Are we doing the right things? And we want basically now to move more of our new housing toward our downtown areas, somewhat along El Camino, but principally in California Avenue and downtown as the new sites, to be smaller units, because the demand for our housing is from young professionals and elderly, and they don't need the big units. And interestingly, even when we have our Association of Bay Area Governments allocation for housing units, they count one 6,000 square foot home the same as a 500 square foot apartment. So we meet those housing allocations, but we'll actually be doing it and addressing who needs the housing the most. And it's also at locations where we're downtown walkable services and adjacent to transit. So out of that, we'll have different challenges, and these will be the discussions that we're going to be having as a council in coming months. But one of the biggest things is, well, how do we have more housing and not a bunch more car trips? And for a long while, urban planners have said, well, down near transit and down near walkable services, people drive a lot less. And there are different studies that show that, and that actually the walkability is more important than the transit use. Although today, we're seeing that our downtown workers are using alternative transportation at almost 50%. It's really surprising. That doesn't make up for places where we have packed in office workers, but the percentage that are using other means is really growing. And I don't know about you, but when we talk to friends who have kids in their 20s, it's shocking to hear that not only do many of these kids not have cars, they're in their 20s and they never bothered to have a driver's license because they don't intend to drive. And it's like, well, wait a minute, where's your Camaro? You know, what was a rite of passage when we were young? But they don't care about it. It's a value structure. They kind of look down on owning cars to a great degree these days. Now, that doesn't mean when they're in their 40s and 50s they're going to have identical lifestyles to what they have today. But we are in the midst of a real significant shift in our transportation modes and patterns and technologies that is shocking. I'll just say a year ago, I didn't believe a lot of this was going to be happening to the degree it appears that it may. And we're going to have some real interesting developments in that. But part of it is some things I'll show you in a minute. Part of it isn't new things. It's things we already know how to do, and we just have to work at executing it. And then other challenges. Just one that we're all very familiar with is the great drought of California. Historic records, I think, believe that it was the greatest drought in 500 years, and there's a real question of whether we're in a period of more likely future droughts because of climate change. And ironically, hand in hand with that goes more frequent severe weather storms, so more flooding and more droughts. You get the best of both worlds. So these are real challenges that we have today. But this goes into the final area that I really wanted to talk about tonight, and that is not just our recent past and our near-term future, but our longer-term future. We are working and in the midst of a couple-year process on two very important plans for the city. The update, our new comprehensive plan. The last one was adopted in 1998, so that's 18 years ago. And our sustainability and climate action plans, where we were one of the first cities in the country to have those plans in the early 2000s. And we have some of our council members here who were at the leadership role in moving Palo Alto to the forefront in a whole bunch of environmental areas, our zero waste program and our renewable energy program. So we have, this year, the council is really focusing on both of these plans, and they're going to guide the future of Palo Alto for coming decades and even generations. These documents are going to be the plans that will influence what kind of community we pass on to our children and our children's children. So that's what I'd like to take a little extra time to talk about today. So our comprehensive plan looks at our great heritage of Palo Alto, and most of you know the HP garage. And then we have to look at, well, what's the transformation to the future? How do we blend the old and the new? And who would have thunk that Palo Alto was going to be a car company town? The headquarters of Tesla Motors and the headquarters of the research arms of almost all of the major global car companies are here, related to Stanford's work, either on campus or in Palo Alto. And this next generation of what's happening in smart and autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, so much of that research and groundwork is being done right here in our community. So fortunately, we also are a community that is embracing this. We're now 4% electric vehicle adoption, the highest in the US. And that's, most of us know that it's just the last few years that these cars started becoming more affordable. And we've been having presentations. Many of you were at our Sustainability and Climate Action Summit, and we had a study session the following evening with Professor Stefan Heck from Stanford, who's a leading researcher on this transformation in transportation and the future of being able to have smart, autonomous or semi-autonomous electric vehicles, reducing the car trips, having clean car trips, and reducing the parking is pretty shocking. And that the cost of electric vehicles being projected, aside from that the far lower operating costs, but the purchase price cost within 7 years is expected to be at or below internal combustion engines. I can tell you that Tesla, when you think about total cost of ownership of electric vehicles, their goal is that over the life of your car, you buy windshield wipers and tires. So the whole model is changing on all of this. But we use the term sustainability a lot. And I spent a decade involved with sustainability programs, and I've kind of get a little uneasy when I see sustainability being used as a term right and left, and we don't quite stop and talk about what it means and understand it. So this is really a fairly established definition. It's the ability to maintain or improve standards of living without damaging or depleting natural resources for our generation or future generations. And I'd say, for instance, in the part of our traffic congestion, it's not good enough to sustain what we have now. We have to get back to where we were a few years ago. So the challenge is even greater. But we've been moving in the right direction. Many of you know that just a couple of years ago, we moved toward carbon-free electricity for our electricity supply. And Palo Alto is the only city in the state that owns all of its utilities. Many cities own a good portion, but we own all of them. And so after we had that, we had a teen group with the media center who came up, and I'll see if I can get this to play right. Nope. David, I may need your help. Let's see, we'll go there. There we go.
Carbon neutral, that's a passion. It's not just a fad of fashion. Carbon neutral for all seasons. There's a rhyme, but there's good reasons. Palo Alto must embrace it. Climate change, so let's face it. Let's face it. To avoid the future, make it cool. Say no way to fossil fuel. This path we travel down before we shoot for carbon free. We score melting glaciers, rising seas, raging storms that bring disease. Planet Earth is like no other. We must act now to help our mother. It's time for action. No more stalling. Power comes from water falling. Power comes from winds that blow. Let carbon neutral energy flow. Sunshine gets electric moving. Now we're carbon neutral grooving. Our founders had the sponsors. The community on electricity was a hot idea that could really cook it. Now you trapped them in that building. Greenhouse gas, you say we gone. Our founding fathers would stay right on. Carbon neutral, that's a passion. It's not just a fad or a fashion. Carbon neutral for all seasons. There's no rhyme, but there's good reasons. Palo Alto must embrace it. Climate's changing, so let's face it. Climate's changing, so just face it. So just face it.
All right. So that's one of our only in Palo Alto sorts of videos, right? Oh, so let me go back. So that takes us back to this traffic issue. And can we fix it? I'm actually optimistic that we can. It's not going to fix itself, I'll guarantee you that. But when we look at, we have the beginnings of a whole program that we're going to be addressing. So some of it, many of you know, Caltrain is going to go through a modernization, electrification program, and level boarding and longer trains, and it will nearly double the capacity of Caltrain. And some of you who take Caltrain may know that it is now standing room only at peak hour. Not only that, at the end of the line, San Francisco has been working on their downtown subway system in 2019. That'll be complete, so you get off a Caltrain and you can go to 4 different stops out to Moscone and Market and Chinatown, and it becomes a just much more efficient, higher capacity, faster and cleaner system. But that's kind of a backbone, and we still have a major problem that we don't have grade separations. And as they look at having more trains, our problems with grade separations will go up even more. We have 2 members of the Cupertino City Council here who last year started with Mayor Holman on an initiative to collaborate on the North and West County cities to try to get the new VTA sales tax measure to take on for the first time major funding in projects that are really important to the North and the West County. We think we're going to have hundreds of millions of dollars toward grade separations from Sunnyvale up to Palo Alto. That doesn't build them all. It's maybe half of the funding that'll be needed. But once you've got that much, you can really start building on it for state and federal grants as we build and work on our design and figure out what the community wants and what would be the best design on it, and to have a process for doing that. But in addition to Caltrain, we really need to have a whole bunch of other mechanisms. The way they talk about the last mile in transportation, meaning when you get off a train, you'll only go as far as the next mile. But it's not really a mile, because if you're walking, it may be a mile. If you're riding or electric skateboard or who knows what, it's more than a mile. But in any event, we're now seeing all these modes of transportation, that from electric bikes to more regular bikes to literally scary electric skateboards, and to make our walking safer and more convenient. But we'll be seeing in the coming weeks, coming before the council, an expansion of our Palo Alto shuttle system. But frankly, the funding that we have available today for local transportation, not the regional that I was talking about on the county sales tax, but local, just within our city, of our shuttle system, expanding our bike system, expanding all of these ride-sharing programs, we don't have the money for. So we may have solutions, and we don't have the money for it yet. But let me take one example of what's possible. Not only could we potentially quadruple or more our shuttle system so that it actually becomes more routes with frequency that people actually say, no, I can step out here, and I know within 10 minutes I'm going to have a shuttle come. And I know it's 8 minutes because my app is showing where that bus is right now, and we can watch that. And actually our biggest local bus system in Palo Alto is the Marguerite system. And for those of you who don't know, I'm going to share, not quite a secret, but they don't like to broadcast it. Place you see the Marguerite buses, they're open to public access. Any of us can ride them. There's no identity check. They're open. They just don't advertise it very much. So we really have a bus system in the community that's even stronger because you've probably seen them around. Stanford has all these different satellite places where in the research park and down out by Embarcadero and by Cal Ave, and they have those shuttles serving them, as well as from Cal Ave up into their employment base up in the research park. So here's one major element of it. We have one of the highest bike commuting rates in the country, but our overall percentage of trips that are done by bicycle is still modestly low. We're like 3.5% of our total trips are by bike in this community. And 3 years ago, my wife Sally came home from driving downtown and trying to find a parking space, then finally finding a parking space, and then having to walk to the destination. She just said, that's it. I'm never driving downtown again. Why have I been doing this? I know it's way faster if I just ride and park right in front of where I want to go, reserve parking space everywhere. And I said, you're right. And we went from being recreational riders to ones where we use it now for 80% of our trips in town. And it's not a chore. It's like I get kind of bummed when I had to drive because had to go someplace because I didn't get my exercise. And it's not even so much of a kind of a moral responsibility one. I should feel that more, but I just enjoy riding over driving. Not to mention, most of the times I'm late for meetings, especially if I'm going at rush hour, is some time where I had to, after the meeting, go outside of town, so I drove my car, and I'm late to the meeting because I drove. And people ask me, when they see me arrive by bike, so that's really good. You rode your bike, that's really commendable. I said, I might have driven, but I didn't have time. So now, what do we really look at about changing a positive social norm, as Becky Beacom would coach me on? And so this is Copenhagen. And Copenhagen, you can see they bundle up a bit more than we do, right? They don't quite have our climate. And they are now up to more than 50% of all of their trips are by bicycle. And that includes people who work in Copenhagen and live outside the city. More than 50%. It's mind-boggling. And then you think about, the weather. And we occasionally, and Greg was saying, well, I've now gotten to the point where I got fenders on and then added another piece of clothing, another. So the Danes have a saying, there's no bad weather, just bad clothing. Now, we don't get bad weather here. So what we see here, that's our bad weather, right? So if they can do that, and look at that bike congestion, and they don't actually, Denmark doesn't get as big a snow as some places, but it doesn't stop them. Imagine what we can have in some of the best weather on the planet. So how big of a wish is this? Well, we have actually a program in Palo Alto with the success level of Copenhagen for biking. and it is our Safe Routes to School program. This started out 15 plus years ago, and we have some of the leaders in that program here tonight. And it has taken us up to where we are now at middle school around 50% of riders, and at high school about 45%. But it doesn't come just by, okay. It doesn't come just by telling kids, ride your bike. We have to make the routes safe, and the city for what, a dozen plus years has had safe routes to school as our #1 transportation priority on traffic calming. And then a whole bunch of education programs like what you see here that goes and teaches kids. You know, if you look back at this slide, you see over in the upper right, that's the training program. How do you teach kids to ride safely and make sure that it is something that they're going to be able to do in a safe way and that they know where to go, and just all these different components. And it really ends up resulting in this kind of data. Now, it's hard to read the bottom lines. The first two ones on the left are not individual years. They're 1985, back before we and other communities saw a steep drop-off in bike riding to school. 1993 is the next one. And then you see the year 2000 is the lowest. And that's when we started this program. And so we were just about 10% of high schoolers, this is the high school data, riding their bikes to school. And we are now almost 45%. Imagine if we had several thousand more cars on the road every peak hour. So we have what is it now, 14,000 kids or so we're up to in the schools, and about half are riding bikes. But remember, if the parent had to take them, it's a car trip each direction. So if about half are doing it, ballpark, we have 14,000 fewer car trips as a result of the kids taking what we're doing to school, and about 12,000 fewer than if we hadn't done anything. Actually, if we hadn't done anything, remember that the trend was downward. And all the traffic of parents dropping off kids, racing around the schools, is part of what makes kids uncomfortable with having their kids ride to school. So we went from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle. And that's what we're doing. We can do this throughout our community. And these are teens, remember. So these are teens who, if they wanted, just got their driver's license, could show off they drive a car, and we're getting this kind of ridership. So we got some other problems. I mentioned earlier that we have a whole series of challenges over climate change. And water, when we had the drought, it really hit people at a very visceral level, even more than kind of thinking about climate change and the energy role. Water hits people. But water hits us a bunch of ways. We get 45% of our clean electricity from hydroelectric power, but that's dropped during the drought. And it's actually the primary reason that we're going to have a rate increase in our electricity this coming year for the first time in 6 years. But we also get our water from the Hetch Hetchy water system. It's some of the best and most expensive water available. And that, even though it stood up better in the drought than almost any other water system in the state, we were mandated to have the same sort of water reduction as other cities. And frankly, Palo Alto had some of the highest achievement in water reduction on a percentage basis in the state. So the community really deserves a great deal of credit for that. But these problems are not going to go away. As I mentioned before, the predictions of climate change are sea level rise on our bayland, which we have many of our properties that are barely above sea level. And when we have storms, whether they be the creek flooding storms or from rising sea level, what happens is we have a convergence, the water coming downhill, and storm surges that come in the bay. And so when that happens with a high tide, we are in trouble in the future unless we address this. So we're going to have climate adaptation, but it also goes to how we can address this and have a sustainable water supply as The ability to store water in the Sierra becomes more problematic, and a whole myriad of things. So this picture, you can recognize Councilmember Du Bois here, but this is down at San Jose's new advanced water recycling plant that is producing water significantly cleaner than what they get out of their taps. And in the coming years, this is going to likely be blended with their regular water. Initially, they're using it for irrigation, but it's ultra pure water. This whole facility, which is, about 3 times the size of what we can see in this picture, even more than that, quadruple the size of what we see in this picture, has 2 employees on staff. Now, they have to have 2 at any given time for safety reasons. I think they're mostly playing cards, because this whole thing is just automated. And the energy cost for water purification is dropping drastically. And for us, that energy is now carbon neutral electricity. So think about a future of a sustainable water supply where we could conceivably recycle to pure water in the range of 30% of our water, using clean energy to power that, and the numbers look like they're lower cost than what we're currently paying for Hetch Hetchy water, because it's tripled on us in recent years as the whole Hetch Hetchy system, 100 years old, had to be rebuilt from start to finish and upgraded for seismic reasons, and that's why our water bill's been going up so much. So that's another vision for the future that is not as dire, but it won't come easily, but it is doable. These things, we see the technology advances, and for communities that will embrace the technology advances and invest in the future, we have some real opportunities towards sustainability. So why also we have a city climate action plan, and really, why does it matter? Well, I hear these arguments that says, well, if you were to measure Palo Alto's impact on the global greenhouse gas emissions, well, frankly, you can't measure it. So why does it matter? At the COP21 conference, where we had an international climate protection treaty by 193 nations, which is almost certainly the most significant environmental agreement in the history of mankind. And we'll look at that in history lessons. This was the first time that mankind began a process of addressing this dire challenge of our generation. One of the leading initiatives over the previous half dozen years that had driven the nations to come together and have a treaty was the initiative of cities and private corporate sector. And those 2 sectors made the progress over the last half dozen years that drove and shamed the national governments to come together on international agreements. And the UN acknowledged that this was a major force. This shows that today, we have most of the world's population in cities, and it is within their power to have great change, but also to be a driver on international agreements and change. So that goes into how do we have that impact? And it's not just doing our share, but by being leaders, Palo Alto, as one of the first cities in the world to have carbon neutral electricity, has been used as a model, as having one of the most aggressive programs on waste reduction. We have an 80% recycling rate of waste, one of the best in California, and California leads the country. In our next generation of activities to reduce our carbon footprint from vehicles, which now that we have clean electricity, transportation is like 60% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So the very same solution that solves our traffic problem and solves our parking problem solves our greenhouse gas emission problem and our air pollution problem. So these things all get knitted together. The transportation element of our comprehensive plan relates to our sustainability and climate action plan. And frankly, when we talk about housing, much of the resistance to housing in the, growing at a faster rate in the community was first about impacts on schools. We now are seeing that we can build the sorts of housing that won't have major impacts on schools and meets the demand. But the other big thing has been the impact on traffic and parking of just growing and growing the population. We have the potential to reduce our car trips from where we are today, not just to add population and not increase it significantly, we have through these programs the potential to reduce it. That is both a great challenge and a great opportunity for all of us. And I really look forward to the community participating in both of these things. We have a great Citizen Advisory Committee on the Comprehensive Plan who has been meeting. They're supposed to meet monthly for a year, and we got them to every 2 weeks for 2 years, and now we're maybe up the schedule a little more. And they are just stepping up to the task and taking on the challenge of this really important guiding document for our community. But we've talked a lot about buildings and things and energy and streets, but a community really is about people. And when we look at kind of the face of Palo Alto, and you may even recognize some old pictures there that we found of Palo Altans. Some of you may, I will see if a guessing game of who gets them all, of all the folks over on the far right. Somebody, I was working with Lon from our staff, and he said, "Who is that woman on the far right?" Is Joan Baez, for those who don't know her. I left out Grace Slick. But when we look at our community, we are a community that has always been changing. And the face of our community, the character of our community, not just the physical environment, but we're changing and evolving and being enriched by the people who come to our community. We are a community of immigrants and diverse ethnic backgrounds that is, like the Bay Area, one of the few places in the world that has this much diversity. And when people come from afar and ask, well, what makes Palo Alto the center of Silicon Valley and the center of technology and innovation? And I could tell them, well, what do you need to do? And they say, well, build a Stanford University, that'll help as a starting point. But aside from that, two of the things we push to them that are value-based, but actually are part of our DNA and what makes us a really, in the true sense of the word, rich community. Not financially rich, but rich in our culture and society, is both the diversity that we have and the way that we invest and feel responsibility to the future. So this is the representative of the face of our community. And this last Sunday, we had a great event here of the first big Chinese New Year event that occurred in Palo Alto. You may have seen the banner coming in. And I was talking with some of my friends who had 170 volunteers who helped put the event on. And next year, if you didn't do it, you've got to see it, but it's going to be a new location because it just overflowed this. Oh, sorry, the fire chief's here. I didn't want to bust us too bad. But it was an enormous and a great event. We're going to find a bigger venue next year. But the organizers had looked at a number of translations of Palo Alto into Chinese. And there are several out there, but this is the one that they selected. And I thought it was wonderful. So I think this really epitomizes what we are as a community, the group of people that we have here, and all of our friends and neighbors, and really the challenges that we have after we've had, in recent years, real struggles figuring out how are we going to recalibrate to be able to retain the quality of life that we really value here, and yet look forward, not back. And I think that we have that opportunity to do so, but it's going to take all of us working together to do this. And I just want to thank all of you. Before I sign off, we're going to have a special treat, which is, or right after I sign off. If everybody will take stay in their seats after I wrap up, we're going to have an ensemble of melodies from the Palo Alto Children's Theater, who's going to give us a performance. But I just want to say thank you to everyone for caring enough about your community to come out tonight. We do have some really good food afterwards, so that's part of the hook. But thank you all for caring so much about this community and for joining us. And And I hope everyone will stay and have a goal of meeting 10 people that they never knew before. And you're all here together and socializing. There's no drink, but we're still sociable animals. So thank you all very much, and let's welcome the Palo Alto Theater Children's Choir.
Another opening, another show in Philly, Boston, or Baltimore. A chance for stage folks to say hello. Another opening of another show.
Another job that you hope at last will make your future forget your past. Another pain where the ulcers grow. Another opening of another show.
4 weeks you rehearse and rehearse. 3 weeks and it couldn't be worse. 1 week, will it ever be right?
Then out of the hat is that big first night. The overture
Is about to start. You cross your fingers and hold your heart.
It's curtain time and away we go.
Another opening of
Another opening of another show.
Hi everyone, my name is Shine Hushmand and I'm going to be singing Love I Hear. Love I hear makes you sigh a lot. Oh, so love I hear leaves you weak. Love I hear makes you blush and turns you ashen. You try to speak with passion and squeak. I hear love, they say, makes you pine away, but you pine away with an idiotic grin. I'm dazed, I'm pale, I'm sick, I'm sore. I've never felt so well before. What's love? I hear, I feel, I fear, I know, I am, I'm sure, I mean, I hope, I trust, I pray I must be in. Forgive me if I shout. Forgive me if I groan. I've only just found out, and well, I thought you ought to know. Thank you.
Come on along and listen to the lullaby of Broadway. The hip hooray and ballyhoo, the lullaby of Broadway.
The rumble of the subway trains, the rattle of the taxis.
The daffodils who entertain at Angelo's and Maxie's.
When a Broadway baby says goodnight, it's early in the morning. Manhattan babies don't sleep tight
Until the dawn. Good night, baby. Good night. Milkman's on his way. Sleep tight, baby. Sleep tight. Let's call it a day. Listen to the
Lullaby of
old Broadway. Yeah.
Yeah.
you all again for coming, and enjoy.